The wind that swept down from the Bitterroot Mountains had a bite to it, a promise of the hard winter to come. It scoured the Montana prairie, kicking up dust the color of old gold and rattling the tin roof of the cookhouse at Dry Willow Ranch. Smoke, thin and gray, curled from the chimney, a solitary signal of life in the vast, browning landscape. This was Jonah Hale's land, all 12,000 acres of it, and in the late autumn of 1888 it felt like he was holding on to it with his bare hands. 2 years after the Great Die-Up, when winter had buried the territory in snow and starved cattle by the tens of thousands, the fear still lingered in the air, as real as the coming frost. Jonah, at 32, wore the worry in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. He was a man carved from the tough pine of the high country, solid and unyielding. He'd had to be. He'd also built a fence around his heart, just as sturdy as the ones he built for his herd. Years ago, a woman with eyes like a summer sky and a laugh like saloon music had promised him forever, then rode off with a horse trader from Cheyenne whose pockets were deeper. Jonah had made a vow that day, a quiet, bitter promise to himself he was done with pretty women. In his mind, that had come to mean he was done with women altogether. They were a complication he could not afford, like a lame horse or a dry well. Far from the main house, a lone figure walked the wagon ruts that served as a road to Gravel Bend. Lena Morrell was 23, and all she owned was bundled in a worn flour sack slung over her shoulder. A failed harvest back home had sent her out on the road, a quiet girl with a spine of steel and a knack for making a feast from next to nothing. She had a gentle face, hands that were chapped but clean, and a sense of pride that was her only real inheritance. She wasn't looking for a husband or for pity. She was looking for work, a cook stove, a roof, and fair wages. That was the extent of her prayer. The sky, which had been a sheet of bruised pewter all morning, finally split open. The rain came down not in drops, but in cold, slanting needles. Lena quickened her pace, her worn boots squelching in the mud. Ahead, she saw the dark shapes of the Dry Willow outbuildings. The largest was the barn, its great doors shut against the weather. She hurried toward it, not daring to go inside without permission, but finding a small measure of shelter under the deep overhang of the roof. She slid down the rough plank wall, pulling her thin shawl tighter. The cold seeped into her bones, to chase it away, to keep her own heart beating steady in the lonely quiet. She began to hum. It was an old tune, a simple melody her mother used to sing while kneading bread. The notes were soft, barely audible above the drumming of the rain on the roof and the sighing of the wind. Jonah Hale was a half-mile away, wrestling with a stretch of fence a stray bull had tested. The rain plastered his hat to his head and ran in rivulets down his neck. He worked with a grim, practiced efficiency, his movements economical and strong. He was about to set a new post when he heard it, a sound so out of place in his world of wind and cattle and the grunt of hard labor that he froze, his hands still on the post maul. He tilted his head, listening. It was music, faint, soft, but undeniably a human voice, weaving a simple, clean melody. He straightened up, scanning the gray expanse. His eyes landed on the small figure huddled against his barn. A woman. A drifter, most likely, caught in the downpour. His first instinct was to ignore her, to finish his work and ride back to the empty quiet of his house. Women brought trouble. He knew that like he knew the face of a storm cloud. But the humming continued, a thread of warmth in the cold air. It wasn't loud or showy. It was private, like a prayer. Something stirred in him, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in years. It wasn't softness, not exactly. It was curiosity. He finished setting the post with 3 sharp, deliberate blows, the sound echoing flatly in the wet air. He coiled his wire, gathered his tools, and swung up onto his steady roan gelding. He rode not toward the house, but in a wide circle that brought him to the far side of the barn, out of the woman's sight. He dismounted, tied the reins, and slipped inside through a side door. From the dusty shadows, He watched her for a moment. She was small, tucked against the wall, her face turned away from the wind. He could see the careful mending on her shawl. She wasn't a saloon girl, that was clear. She looked decent and tired. He tore a scrap from a shipping notice tacked to a stall, found the nub of a carpenter's pencil in his coat pocket, and wrote. His hand, more used to holding reins than a pencil, was large and clumsy, the letters thick and dark. He went back out the way he came, mounted his horse, and rode past the front of the barn. Without slowing, he leaned down and tucked the folded paper into a crack in the wall, just a few feet from where she sat. Then he nudged the roan into a trot and headed for the house, not looking back. Lena saw the horse and rider, a dark shape moving through the rain, but thought nothing of it until she saw the fleck of white paper wedged in the wall. She waited until he was gone, then cautiously got to her feet. Her joints ached with cold. She pulled the paper free. The writing was rough, plain. Didn't know a cook stove could sing. She stared at the words. It wasn't an invitation. It wasn't an insult. It was a statement, an observation, offered up as dryly as the prairie dust. A small smile touched her lips for the first time that day. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her pocket. The rain was letting up. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath, and walked toward the main house. Jonah saw her coming from the window. He opened the door before she could knock, filling the frame. He was taller than she'd thought, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the sun and wind. "You the singer?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble, devoid of pleasantry. "I was humming, sir," Lena replied, her own voice steady. "I apologize if I disturbed you. I was just sheltering from the rain." "My last cook got married off to a sodbuster in the next county," Jonah said, getting straight to the point. "Can you cook for 10 hungry men? Can you make sourdough rise and stretch a side of beef to last a week?" Lena's chin came up a fraction. "I can cook, sir. I can bake. I can manage a pantry, and I do not waste." He looked her up and down, his gaze missing nothing, from her worn-out boots to the determined set of her mouth. He was weighing her, judging her. He was looking for a reason to say no. He was looking for the flaw, the hint of trouble. He found none, only a quiet resilience that was as plain as her brown wool dress. "The job is yours for the winter," he said, the words coming out as if they cost him something. "Pay is $20 a month and board. You'll answer to me. The men are rough, but they'll respect the cookhouse. You keep to your work. I'll keep to mine. One rule." He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Just cooking, no idle chatter." "I understand, sir." Lena said. She did. This was a man who wanted his life orderly and quiet. He wanted a cook, not a companion. That suited her just fine. "Name's Jonah Hale. The cookhouse is out back. Find what you need. Supper is at 6. He stepped back and shut the door, leaving her on the porch. The interview was over. The next day, Jonah sent her into Gravel Bend with one of the younger ranch hands, a boy named Tim, for supplies. The town was little more than a single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and Banker Wilkes's imposing brick establishment. At Pike's General Mercantile. A bell above the door announced their arrival. The place smelled of coffee beans, leather, and Mrs. Pike's sharp curiosity. Mrs. Pike, a woman whose body was as square as her opinions, watched Lena with eyes that missed nothing. "New cook at Dry Willow, are you?" she asked, while weighing out a sack of flour. "Yes, ma'am," Lena said, handing her the list Jonah had written. A few other women were in the store, and they stopped their conversations to listen. Lena could feel their eyes on her, measuring her, speculating. "Hale hasn't had a woman cook out there in years. Mrs." Pike continued, her voice carrying across the store. "Not since—" She trailed off, glancing at the other women with a look of shared knowledge. From the back of the store, a man emerged, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He was thick-set, with a swagger in his walk and a sneer that seemed permanent. This was Cole Baird, Jonah's foreman. He'd wanted a raise, and Jonah had turned him down flat. The resentment simmered in him, hot and constant. He looked Lena over, his gaze lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. Well, he said, his voice slick. Looks like the boss finally decided to get some scenery worth looking at. Tim, the young ranch hand, shifted his feet nervously. We just need the supplies, Cole. Cole ignored him, his eyes still on Lena. You be careful out there, girl. It's a lonely place. A man like Hale, he's got his reasons for keeping to himself. The words were a warning laced with insinuation. Lena met his gaze directly, her expression calm. I am there to cook, Mr. Baird, that is all. She paid for the goods with the money Jonah had given her, her movements precise and dignified. But as she and Tim loaded the wagon, she heard the whispers from the store carried on the wind. A pretty young thing like that. Aims to climb high, I'd wager. Hale swore off women. Wonder how long that'll last. The words were like small, sharp stones. Lena knew this world. She knew how a woman's reputation could be shredded by gossip before she'd even had a chance to build it. The conflict wasn't just in town, it was back at the ranch, too. A low hum of tension beneath the surface of daily life. Jonah was deep in debt to banker Wilkes, a man with a polite smile and a heart like a cash register. The loan was due in the spring, and the only way to pay it was with the herd of cattle currently grazing on the high plains. But the weather was turning early. An early blizzard could trap the herd, starve them, and ruin him. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on his shoulders. Cole Baird felt that pressure and saw it as an opportunity. He watched Jonah with resentful eyes, performing his duties with a sullen correctness but missing no chance to undermine his boss in small ways. A broken latch here, a late report of a sick steer there. He saw Lena's arrival not as a convenience, but as a weakness, a chink in Jonah's armor. A man distracted, Cole figured, was a man who made mistakes, and he was waiting for a mistake. For Lena, the cookhouse became her sanctuary. It was a simple log building, but it was warm and orderly. She scrubbed the tables, organized the pantry, and soon had it running with a quiet efficiency that Jonah, from a distance, could not help but notice. The coffee was stronger, the biscuits were lighter, and the men, even Cole, fell silent when she placed the steaming platters of food on the table. She held to their agreement. She cooked. She did not engage in idle chatter. She spoke when she needed to, her voice polite and clear, but offered no personal stories, no friendly inquiries. And yet, her presence changed the rhythm of the place. There was a quiet hum from her corner of the ranch, a sense of order and care that had been missing. Jonah found himself watching her sometimes, when he thought she wouldn't notice. He watched her knead dough, her movements sure and strong. He saw her mending one of the ranch hand's shirts by the light of a lantern. He felt the unsettling pull of that old curiosity. He had hired a cook, a pair of hands to do a job. But he had gotten something more. He had gotten a quiet song in the rain, a steady presence in his chaotic world. And for a man who had sworn off every pretty woman, it was the most dangerous thing of all. The wind never ceased its assault on Dry Willow. It howled down the draws of the bitter roots, a mournful, hungry sound that pried at the chinking between the logs of the cookhouse. But inside, Lena Morrell had created a small pocket of defiance. The air was warm and smelled of yeast, simmering beans, and the faint, clean scent of the wild thyme she had gathered and hung from the rafters to dry. She was a general commanding an army of pots and pans, and her campaign was one of quiet order against the encroaching chaos of the wild. She wasted nothing. Beef tallow was rendered and saved in a tin, perfect for frying potatoes or greasing a pan for cornbread. Scraps were boiled for stock. She started a sourdough culture in an earthenware crock, a living thing she fed with flour and water, and soon the ranch hands were eating bread with a tangy, complex flavor that was a world away from the hardtack they were used to. Her domain was a fortress of warmth and sustenance. At the end of each day, after the last dish was washed and dried, she would take her primary kitchen towel, a square of white cotton, wash it meticulously, and fold it into a perfect, clean square on the edge of the dry sink. It was a small ritual, a testament to her belief that even in a place this rough, a little bit of order could be maintained. Jonah observed this transformation from a distance. He said nothing, offered no praise, but one night, after a particularly vicious gust of wind had sent a shower of dust down onto the stovepipe, he waited until the lights in the main house and the bunkhouse were out. In the cold, star-dusted darkness, he climbed onto the roof of the cookhouse with a bucket of pitch and a handful of shingles. He worked silently, his hammer blows muffled, sealing the cracks against the wind and the coming snow. He was gone before the first hint of dawn, leaving no sign of his work except for a roof that no longer leaked. The next morning, when Lena stepped out to fetch wood, she found a tall, neatly stacked pile of split pine just outside her door, far more than she would need for the day. It was dry and cut to the perfect length for her stove. There was no note, no explanation. And the next morning, there was another pile just like it. It became a silent conversation. The wind would blow, the wood would appear, and the kitchen would remain warm. He held tight to the vow he had made, that wall he had built around himself. He told himself this was just practicality. A good cook was an asset, and it was his duty to maintain his assets, just like his barn or his fences. But sometimes, when he walked past the cookhouse and a snatch of her quiet humming reached him, he would feel a crack in that wall. He would remember that first day, the sound of her voice in the rain, and he would have to consciously harden himself against it. He kept his interactions with her brief and to the point. He would give her instructions for the week, listen to her list of needed supplies, and leave. He was the ranch owner. She was the cook. The distance between them was a chasm he was determined to maintain. Lena, for her part, felt the distance and understood it. She had seen men like Jonah Hale before, men who used silence and a harsh exterior as armor. She did not try to breach it. She simply did her job with a quiet competence that was its own form of communication. She faced her own battles. Another trip to Pike's General Mercantile confirmed that the whispers had not died down. Must be serving him more than just beef stew to keep him happy. Lena heard one woman mutter to another as she examined a bolt of calico. Mrs. Pike, weighing out sugar, looked at Lena over the top of her spectacles. "A single woman on a ranch full of men," she said, her voice dripping with false concern. "One must be so careful with one's reputation." "I am careful with my work, Mrs. Pike," Lena replied, her voice even and calm. "My reputation will have to take care of itself." She paid her bill, her back straight, and walked out into the dusty street, leaving a thick silence behind her. She knew she was being judged not for who she was, but for what they imagined her to be. Proving them wrong would not be a matter of words, but of conduct. One afternoon, Jonah was standing on the porch, staring out at the bruised-looking clouds gathering over the mountains, when he saw the mail rider coming, a small speck of motion in the vast landscape. The rider, a lanky youth named Seth, arrived once a week, his saddlebags holding the ranch's only tangible link to the outside world. He handed Jonah a small bundle of letters and a newspaper. "This one looks important. Mr. Hale," Seth said, pointing to a thick envelope with an official-looking wax seal, "from the Territorial Bank in Helena." Jonah took it, his gut tightening. It could only be bad news, a foreclosure notice, most likely. Wilkes was moving faster than he'd thought. He thanked the boy and went inside, sinking into the hard chair behind his desk. He stared at the envelope for a long moment before slicing it open with his pocket knife. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. The legal language was dense, but the words at the bottom were clear enough to knock the wind out of him. Mortgage, paid in full. Account, closed. He read it again, then a third time. It made no sense. It was impossible. He hadn't paid it. He couldn't pay it. A wave of dizzying relief washed over him, so potent it left him weak. Was it a mistake? A miracle had his father's estranged brother in the East finally answered a letter after all these years' hope. An emotion he had long suppressed surged through him. He leaned back, the letter trembling in his hand, a rough laugh escaping his lips. For the first time in 2 years, he felt the crushing weight on his chest begin to lift. He was still sitting there, staring at the paper as if it might vanish, when a soft knock came at the door. "Sir, I have a fresh pot of coffee." It was Lena. "Come in," he said, his voice hoarse. She entered carrying a tray with a steaming pot and a single mug. She set it on the corner of his desk, her movements quiet and unobtrusive. Her eyes fell on the official letter in his hand, and then on his face. She saw the mixture of shock and dawning joy there, and a rare, small smile touched her lips. "Good news, Mr. Hale?" she asked softly. I think so," he stammered. Feeling a fool for his uncharacteristic display of emotion, he felt an urge to share it, to make it real by telling someone. "The bank, they say the mortgage is canceled. Paid." She glanced at the document again, her brow furrowing slightly. "May I see?" He was so buoyed by the news that he handed it to her without a second thought. She took the paper, her fingers brushing his. She held it up to the light from the window, her gaze sharp and focused. She wasn't reading the words so much as studying the paper itself, the ink, the seal. "When my father was alive," she said, her voice low and thoughtful, "I used to help him with his paperwork for the land office, tax payments, deeds, things like that. He always told me to look at the seal first. It's the official mark." She pointed a slim finger at the red wax at the bottom of the page. "The territorial bank seal has a bison in the center, with the mountains behind it. This one, the bison is facing the wrong way, and the lettering for the county name is not quite right. It's a very good copy, but it's not the real thing." Jonah's elation evaporated like a drop of water on a hot stove, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fury. He snatched the letter back, his hope turning to ash. He looked closely at the seal, and now that she had pointed it out, he could see the small imperfections. It was a fake, a cruel, calculated deception. He crumpled the paper in his fist, his knuckles white. "Wilkes," he breathed, the name a curse. The banker was playing a game, a vicious one. What was the purpose? To make him relax, to make him think he was safe, so he would miss a real deadline. It was a snake's move, and Cole Baird was surely the one who had helped it strike. He looked at Lena. She was watching him, her expression one of quiet empathy. She had just saved him from a fool's paradise, from a mistake that could have cost him everything. She had seen what he, in his desperation, had overlooked. She had done it not by being a pretty distraction, but by being smart, observant, and knowledgeable. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her, fighting to control the rage boiling inside him. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. "You're a fine cook," he said finally, his voice rough, his eyes still fixed on the unforgiving landscape. He turned his head slightly. "But don't sing on the porch. The wind is listener enough." It was his way of saying thank you. It was his way of acknowledging what she had done while simultaneously pushing her away, re-establishing the wall between them. It was clumsy, and he knew it. Lena did not flinch. A small, knowing smile touched her lips, a glimmer of light in the dim room. "The wind hears," she said, her voice soft but clear. "But who does it tell, sir?" She picked up the coffee tray and let herself out, closing the door gently behind her, leaving Jonah Hale alone with a counterfeit letter, a very real debt, and the unnerving realization that the quiet woman in his kitchen saw more than he ever wanted anyone to see. The first snows came not with the fury of a blizzard, but as a quiet thief in the night. The flakes drifted down from a sky the color of lead, ghosting through the pine trees and laying a thin, deceptive blanket of white over the hard, frozen earth. It was beautiful, the way a well-honed knife is beautiful, and it carried the same threat. For Jonah Hale, every flake was a ticking clock. The cattle were still on the high range, and the newborn calves, this year's fragile prophet, were dangerously vulnerable. There was no discussion, only action. At dawn, with the snow still falling, Jonah and his crew of 8 men were in their saddles, riding out. The air was sharp and thin, burning the lungs. They worked for 2 days straight, their faces raw from the wind, their bodies aching with a cold that seeped deep into the bone. They pushed the reluctant herd down from the high country, the bawling of the calves a constant, weary complaint against the vast, white silence. They drove them toward Willow Narrows, a deep, sheltered canyon where the wind was blunted and there was enough winter forage to keep the animals alive. Back at the ranch, the cookhouse became the heart of the operation. It was the only place that was truly warm, a beacon in the swirling snow. Lena worked from before sunrise until long after dark. She kept a massive pot of coffee perpetually hot on the stove and cooked vats of thick, nourishing stew that the men would eat in shifts, wolfing it down in exhausted silence before heading back out. She was no longer just a cook. She was the quartermaster of a small, besieged army. One evening, Tim, the young ranch hand, stumbled into the cookhouse, his face pale and his movements clumsy. He had been sent to check on the small flock of sheep in the lower pasture and had been caught in a sudden, vicious squall. He collapsed onto a bench, cradling his right hand. "Cannot feel it," he mumbled, his teeth chattering. "Cannot feel a thing." Lena took one look at the hand and saw the waxy, dead-white color of deep frostbite. A couple of the other hands gathered around, their expressions helpless. "Get him by the fire," Lena commanded, her voice cutting through their uncertainty. "And bring me a basin of lukewarm water. Not hot. You hear me, lukewarm." While one man did as he was told, she gently began to unbutton Tim's frozen coat. She worked with a calm, methodical purpose that settled the nerves of the others. She submerged his hand in the basin, watching it with a hawk's intensity. Then she made him drink 2 mugs of hot, sweet coffee and wrapped him in a thick wool blanket. An hour later, as painful feeling began to return to his hand in a wave of pins and needles, she carefully cleaned the skin and bandaged the worst of the forming blisters with clean rags and a salve of her own making. Jonah came in later, his shoulders slumped with fatigue, a layer of ice clinging to his eyebrows. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene Tim asleep by the fire, his hand carefully wrapped, and Lena quietly scrubbing the basin she had used. She had saved the boy from losing his fingers, maybe his whole hand. She had done it without fuss, without panic, simply because it needed to be done. He said nothing. He did not need to. He just turned and walked out. But she saw the look in his eyes, a brief, unguarded flicker of respect. The snow stopped, leaving the world pristine and dangerously cold. The cattle were safe for now in the Narrows, but a new threat emerged. A pack of prairie wolves, made bold by hunger, began to circle the ranch. They were led by a huge, gray male, a cunning old survivor who was missing his left eye, a ragged scar puckering the space where it had been. The hands called him One Eye. At night, their howls echoed from the hills, a chilling chorus that made the sheep huddle together in terror. One night, the howls turned into the frantic, high-pitched bleating of a flock under attack. Lights flared in the bunkhouse as men grabbed rifles, but Lena was closer. She did not hesitate. She seized the largest iron stew pot and a heavy ladle, threw open the cookhouse door, and ran out into the moonlit snow. She charged toward the sheep pen, a small, determined figure in the vast whiteness, banging the pot with the ladle, creating a deafening, discordant clangor that shattered the night's silence. The wolves, startled by the sudden, unfamiliar noise, faltered in their attack. One Eye turned, his single yellow orb fixing on her for a moment, a look of malevolent intelligence in his gaze. Then, with a low snarl, he melted back into the shadows, the rest of the pack following him. By the time Jonah and the other men reached the pen, rifles ready, the wolves were gone. They saw only Lena, standing in the snow, the pot in one hand and the ladle in the other, her breath coming in white plumes. From the shadows of the bunkhouse, Cole Baird watched the scene, a contemptuous smile twisting his lips. He had not bothered to grab his rifle. "Quite the show," he drawled to one of the other hands, his voice loud enough for Lena to hear as she walked back. "All that fuss for a few sheep? A person might think she wants the boss to see how brave she is." Lena ignored him, her head held high, but the words stung. Her act of courage was instantly twisted into a cheap calculation in his eyes. A few days later, Cole rode into Gravel Bend. He did not go to the saloon first. He went to the bank. Banker Wilkes greeted him in his private office. The door shut firmly behind them. The room was warm, filled with the smell of cigar smoke and old paper. "The snow came early, just as you predicted," Wilkes said, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey. "It will slow him down," Cole confirmed, taking a glass. "The herd is safe for now, but moving them to the railhead for the sale will be a mess. Mud, swollen creeks. He'll be late for the delivery date in his contract with the buyers. I will make sure of it." "And if he is late," Wilkes said, a thin smile on his lips, "the contract is void. He will have no cash to pay me. The note comes due, and the ranch is mine. The courts will see it no other way." "The whole place," Cole said, his eyes gleaming with greed. "And our agreement stands the eastern pasture, with the Spring Creek, is mine." "A man who provides such useful information deserves a reward," Wilkes affirmed. "You will get your land, Mr. Baird." They drank to their conspiracy, 2 predators circling a wounded animal, confident in the kill. Back at Dry Willow, the world was unaware of their plotting. An uneasy peace had settled. The sun was out, glinting off the snow-covered landscape. Jonah found Lena behind the cookhouse, tossing potato peelings to the chickens. He was leading a quiet gray mare, a sturdy, gentle-eyed horse. "You need to learn to ride," he said, without preamble. It was not a question. Lena looked up, surprised. "Sir." "This is not a town. Sometimes you need to move faster than your own 2 feet, he said, his tone gruff, as if he were explaining a purely practical matter. "You stood up to those wolves. You saved Tim's hand. It is time." He helped her onto the mare's back, his hands firm and impersonal at her waist as he lifted her. He adjusted the stirrups, then took the reins. "Her name is Smoke. She is quiet. She will take care of you." He led her out onto the open prairie, the horses' hooves crunching softly in the snow. The air was so cold it felt solid, and their breath, and the horses, plumed around them like smoke. The world was utterly silent, painted in shades of white and blue in the dark green of the distant pines. "Hold the reins like this," he said, his voice low. He put his hand over hers, his fingers rough and calloused against her skin. It was the first time they had touched for more than a fleeting second. A strange current, warm and startling, passed between them. He seemed to feel it too, because he pulled his hand away quickly. "Look where you want to go," he instructed, his voice a little rougher than before. "Not down at her head. She will follow your gaze." They spent an hour out on the silent, sunlit prairie. He walked beside the horse, teaching her to guide Smoke with a light touch on the reins, with a shift in her weight. He spoke only when necessary, his instructions clear and concise, but in the shared silence, in the rhythm of the horse's steps and the vast, cold beauty surrounding them. Something new was being built. It was a fragile thing, made of unspoken gratitude and a dawning, mutual respect. He was no longer just the boss, and she was no longer just the cook. They were 2 people, alone together under the immense Montana sky, learning a new language that had nothing to do with words. The cold deepened. It was a living entity, a predator that stalked the draws and hollows of Dry Willow, searching for weakness. It found it in the youngest of the calves, those born late in the season. A deep, wet cough started among them, a harbinger of death that could sweep through the herd and gut Jonah's entire year. For 3 days and 2 nights, he and his men fought it. They lived in the saddle, their world shrinking to the scope of a lantern's glow in a snow-swept night. They moved the sickest animals into the relative shelter of the big barn, turning it into a field hospital that smelled of hay, sickness, and wood smoke from the small fires they kept burning in iron barrels. They forced warm milk mixed with whiskey down the throats of calves too weak to stand, and they rubbed the shivering animals with rough burlap sacks to bring life back to their limbs. It was desperate, brutal work, a battle fought inch by inch against the vast, uncaring indifference of a Montana winter. Jonah worked with a grim fury, pushing himself past the point of exhaustion, then pushing further still. He was everywhere at once, lifting a fallen calf, directing his men, his voice a raw rasp in the frozen air. He did not sleep. He barely ate, grabbing handfuls of the cold biscuits Lena sent out with the coffee pot. He was running on sheer will, the fear of failure a sharper spur than any rowel. On the third morning, the fight broke. The wind died down, and a pale, watery sun appeared, offering no warmth but a respite from the onslaught. 3 calves had been lost, but the rest were stabilizing. The coughing had subsided. The battle was won. For now. The men, hollow-eyed and staggering with fatigue, stumbled back toward the bunkhouse and collapsed into their bunks, fully clothed. Jonah, however, did not go to the main house. He walked on legs that felt disconnected from his body toward the one place that promised warmth. He pushed open the door to the cookhouse and stood there, swaying slightly, a man made of ice and weariness. Snow was caked on his coat, and his beard was stiff with frozen breath. Lena was there, moving quietly in the warm, lamplit space. She had been working as relentlessly as any of them, keeping the coffee flowing, the food ready, her small domain, the anchor that had held them all. She took one look at his face, at the profound exhaustion etched into every line, and said nothing. She simply pulled out a chair at the small table near the cast-iron stove. He sank into it, his body finally admitting its defeat. She moved with a silent efficiency that was a balm to his shattered nerves. She ladled a thick stew of beans and smoked bacon into a bowl, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. Beside it, she placed a thick slice of her sourdough bread, the crust a perfect, deep brown. There were no candles, no ceremony. It was a meal, plain and honest. She poured 2 mugs of tea from a copper kettle that sat on the back of the stove, its surface glowing a dull, warm red in the lamplight. It was a blend of mint and chamomile she had brought with her, a simple comfort for a worn-out soul. She set a mug before him and sat down opposite with her own. For a long time, the only sounds were the soft ticking of the stove as it cooled and the low, gentle hum of the kettle. He ate slowly, like a man relearning how to use his hands. The warmth of the stew spread through him, chasing away the deep, biting cold. He finished the bowl, wiped it clean with the bread, and leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed. He looked older than his 32 years, a man worn down by the land he fought so hard to keep. He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time without the shield of his own making between them. He saw the strength in her quiet face, the steady competence in her hands wrapped around her mug. She had not offered a single word of pity or praise. She had simply given him what he needed: warmth, sustenance, and silence. "A lone rancher swore off every pretty woman," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing, full of rust. The words hung in the warm air, a confession he had not even known he was going to make. He told her about it then, the whole sorry story, about the girl with the laugh like saloon music, the promises that had turned to dust, the bitter shame of being left for a man with more money. He spoke of the vow he had made in the ashes of that humiliation, a vow to never again let a woman close enough to hurt him, to build his life on the solid bedrock of work and solitude, things that could be trusted. He fell silent, staring down at his own hands, which were chapped raw and cracked from the cold and the wet ropes. He swore he would never be a fool like that again. He took a slow breath, and when he looked up at her, his gaze was clear and stripped of all pretense, until a virgin cook served him gentle love for life. The words were not a proposition. They were a statement of fact, a revelation that had dawned on him in his exhaustion. It was not the love of songs and poems. It was the quiet, steady, life-giving care she had shown him and his men since the day she arrived. It was the order she brought to his chaos, the warmth she created against the cold, the intelligence that had seen through a banker's lie, the courage that had faced down wolves. It was a love that nourished, that healed, that asked for nothing in return. Lena's heart gave a painful thump in her chest. She did not look away. She simply absorbed his words, her expression soft. She reached across the table, her fingers gently touching the back of his hand where the skin was split and bleeding over the knuckles. "Your hands," she said softly. She got up and came back with a small pot of salve and a roll of clean cloth. She pulled a chair up beside him and took his hand in hers. Her touch was light, almost clinical at first, as she carefully cleaned the cracked skin. He watched her, his hand, which could break a horse or set a fence post, lying passively in hers. She wrapped the cloth around his wrist, her movements sure and gentle. When she was done, her fingers lingered for a moment on his skin, a touch that was no longer just practical, but personal and deeply comforting. He did not pull away. He turned his hand and loosely clasped hers. They sat like that for a long moment, the silence no longer empty, but filled with a profound and fragile new understanding. He let go of her hand and stood, moving to stand before the stove, holding his hands out to the residual warmth. She followed, standing beside him, close but not touching. The weariness of the long night settled over them, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, trusting gesture. He stiffened for an instant, then relaxed, letting his own shoulder take her weight. They stood there, two solitary figures finding a shared anchor in the quiet heart of the ranch. The copper kettle on the stove murmured softly, a sound like a contented sigh. He turned his head, his face close to hers. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose in the lamplight. He could smell the clean scent of soap and wood smoke that clung to her. "Lena," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "May I?" She did not answer with words. She simply tilted her face up to his, her eyes giving him the permission he sought. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a slow, gentle kiss, hesitant at first, then deepening with a relief so profound it was almost a prayer. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, of finding a harbor after a long and brutal storm. It was a promise, made in the quiet of the cookhouse, with no witnesses but the humming kettle and the sleeping ranch outside. The next morning, Jonah Hale awoke in his own bed, but he felt like a different man. The weariness was still in his bones, but the crushing weight on his soul was gone. Hope, which he had thought long dead, was a small, steady flame inside him. He had a backup plan to ease the pressure from Wilkes, a plan to sell off the eastern pasture with its valuable Spring Creek. It would cripple the ranch's future growth, but it would buy him time. He stood on his porch, looking out at the sun on the snow, at the land his father had left him, but he was seeing it with new eyes. It was not just a debt to be paid or a legacy to be protected. It was a future to be built. Selling a piece of it now felt like selling a piece of that future. He made his decision. He would not sell the pasture. He would fight for every acre. It would be harder, riskier. But for the first time in years, he was not fighting alone. He had found something worth more than a clear title or a paid-off loan. He had found something gentle and strong and true. And he would be damned if he would let any banker or any winter take it away from him. The kiss by the fire had not been spoken of again, but it lived in the space between them. It was in the way Jonah's eyes would linger on Lena for a moment longer than necessary when he came to the cookhouse for coffee, and in the quiet way she made sure that coffee was always fresh and hot. The copper kettle on her stove kept up its soft, humming conversation, a constant, gentle sound in a world that had suddenly grown quieter and yet more charged. Jonah's decision not to sell the eastern pasture had sent a clear signal to Banker Wilkes in Gravel Bend. The message was not received with pleasure. As the snows of early winter began to recede in a brief, unseasonable thaw, the town of Gravel Bend decided to hold its annual jubilee. It was a celebration of survival, a chance for isolated ranchers and townspeople to gather, trade, and forget the hardships of the frontier for a day. There would be horse races, a town picnic, and a dance in the evening. "We are going," Jonah announced one morning, his tone leaving no room for argument. Lena looked up from the bread she was kneading, a dusting of flour on her cheek. "The men will need their supper, sir." "Tim can handle the stew for one night," Jonah said. "I want you to go." He wanted the whole territory to see her at his side. It was a statement, a line drawn in the muddy street of the town for all to see. Lena understood this. The thought of facing the whispering women in Pike's Mercantile made her stomach tighten, but the look on Jonah's face, a mixture of determination and a silent plea, gave her strength. She simply nodded. "I will need a new ribbon for my hair." The day of the Jubilee was bright and cold. The main street of Gravel Bend was crowded with wagons, horses, and people dressed in their Sunday best. The air buzzed with laughter and talk. Lena, in her plain but well-mended blue dress and a new, matching ribbon in her hair, felt 100 pairs of eyes on her as she walked beside Jonah. He was oblivious to them, or pretended to be, pointing out a fine-looking stallion and greeting other ranchers with a curt nod. The whispers followed them like a cloud of gnats, but Jonah's presence, his quiet authority, kept them at a distance. For a few hours, Lena allowed herself to relax. She watched the children's foot races and listened to a fiddler play a lively tune. Then, near the long tables set up for the picnic, the whispers took on a human form. A woman approached them, dressed in a fashionable traveling suit of dark green velvet that must have cost more than Lena earned in a year. She was elegant, handsome, and her smile was as cold as a winter morning. Jonah stiffened beside her. "Jonah Hale," the woman said, her voice carrying a cultured, Eastern inflection. "It has been years. I was just visiting friends in Helena when I heard you were still out here wrestling with the dirt." "Eleanor," Jonah said, his voice flat. "What are you doing in Gravel Bend?" "My name is Eleanor Vance now," she corrected him smoothly, "and I was simply curious to see what became of you." Her eyes, the color of hard jade, slid from Jonah to Lena, dismissing her in a single sweeping glance. "And I see you have acquired new help." The insult was deliberate, meant to wound and to classify. Lena felt the blood rush to her cheeks, but she stood her ground, her chin held high. "Lena Morell is my cook," Jonah said, his voice dangerously quiet. Eleanor Vance gave a tinkling, unpleasant laugh. "Oh, I am sure she is. A pretty little thing. You always did have a weakness for a pretty face. Jonah, it is a shame it never came with good sense. One must wonder what services she provides beyond the kitchen to merit a personal introduction at the Jubilee." The crowd around them had gone silent. Everyone was watching, listening. This was more than gossip. It was a public execution. Lena felt stripped bare, her dignity torn from her by this woman's cruel, polished words. But before she could even think of a response, Jonah stepped slightly forward, placing himself between Lena and the woman. His face was like carved stone, his eyes blazing with a cold fire Eleanor had never seen. "I would rather marry a woman who knows how to feed a ranch with her own 2 hands, he said, his voice ringing out clear and strong in the sudden silence, "than one who only knows how to feed rumors." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a stunning public declaration, a defense so absolute and unexpected that it left Eleanor Vance speechless, her painted smile frozen on her face. Jonah turned his back on her, took Lena's arm gently, and led her away from the gaping crowd, leaving the woman from Helena standing alone in a sea of judgment that had suddenly turned against her. They returned to Dry Willow as dusk was settling, the silence in the wagon thick with the echoes of the afternoon. The wind had picked up again, a wild, mournful sound that whipped across the prairie. As they neared the ranch, a strange, flickering orange glow appeared against the dark line of the hills. "What is that?" Lena asked, her voice tight with a sudden, nameless fear. Jonah did not answer. He slapped the reins, urging the horses into a gallop. The glow grew brighter, angrier. It was fire. As they crested the last rise, they saw it. The hayshed, which stood perilously close to the cookhouse, was a roaring inferno, the flames leaping high into the night sky, fanned by the relentless wind. He hauled the horses to a stop and was out of the wagon before it had fully settled. Men were shouting, running with buckets, their efforts futile against the blaze. Colbert was among them, yelling orders, but his eyes had a strange, feverish glitter to them. "Lena, stay in the wagon!" Jonah yelled over the roar. But she was already out, her eyes fixed on the cookhouse. The wind was driving the embers directly onto its dry log walls, her home, her sanctuary. Inside was her small book of recipes her mother had given her, the sourdough starter crock that was like a living part of her. Without thinking, she ran toward it. Lena Jonah's roar was one of pure terror, but she did not hear it. She ducked under the overhang, yanked the door open, and plunged into the smoke that was already filling the small space. She found the recipe book on its shelf and grabbed the heavy crock. The room was hot as a furnace, the air thick and choking. A burning timber from the roof crashed down, grazing her arm and showering sparks onto the floor. She cried out in pain as the fire licked at her sleeve. Suddenly, the main door was kicked in. Jonah burst through the smoke, his face a mask of desperation. He saw her, grabbed her, and half-dragged, half-carried her toward the door. As they stumbled out into the night, another section of the roof collapsed behind them in a shower of fire. He pulled her away from the burning building, his arms tight around her. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and relief. "My arm," she gasped, coughing, her lungs aching from the smoke. He saw the blood then, a dark stain spreading on her sleeve. Without a word, she reached to the hook by the door, where a clean white kitchen towel was hanging, miraculously untouched by the flames. She yanked it free and pressed it against the burn and the gash on her arm. The men, seeing Jonah and Lena were safe, redoubled their efforts, focusing on saving the main house and the barn. They fought the fire for hours, a desperate, losing battle against the wind. By midnight, the cookhouse and the hay shed were gone, reduced to a heap of blackened, smoldering ruins. The ranch hands, their faces black with soot, their expressions grim, looked at Lena with a new kind of respect. She had faced down the town's gossip, and she had faced down a fire. She was one of them. Jonah did not sleep. He sent the exhausted men to their beds and stood vigil over the smoking remains all night, a rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the darkness. He was guarding the ashes of what had been Lena's home, his posture that of a man protecting his own heart. The dawn came, gray and cold, revealing the full extent of the devastation. The heart of the ranch had been ripped out, as the weary hands gathered, staring at the wreckage. A rider approached. It was not the mail carrier. He was a clerk from Banker Wilkes's office. He dismounted and handed Jonah a thick envelope. "From Mr. Wilkes," the clerk said, avoiding Jonah's eyes, and then he quickly remounted and rode away. Jonah tore it open. It was a formal notice of default, a document filled with legal phrases claiming he had violated an obscure clause in his loan agreement. The entire mortgage was being called due, payable in full within 10 days. It was a death sentence for Dry Willow, delivered to a man standing in the ashes of his own life. The timing was too perfect, too cruel. It was a coordinated attack. A wave of black despair washed over Jonah. He was exhausted, emotionally raw, and now, this. He felt the ranch, his father's legacy, his entire world, slipping through his fingers. He dropped the papers, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Lena came to his side. Her arm was bandaged, her face pale beneath the streaks of soot, but her eyes were clear and steady. She picked up the scattered papers and looked through them. "This seal," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It is the same as the other one. It is not right." She looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw not defeat, but a flicker of fighting spirit. "He is a cheat and a liar. Jonah, we cannot fight him here. The law in Gravel Bend belongs to him. We must go to the county seat. We must go to Rivali and file a formal protest. We will show them these forgeries. We will tell them what happened. We will fight him with the real law." Her words cut through his despair like a clean, sharp knife. She was right. To stay here was to lose. Their only chance was to take the fight to a bigger stage. He looked from her determined face to the smoldering ruins, and then back to her. He saw the white towel she had used as a bandage, now stained with soot and a dark streak of her blood. It was a banner, a symbol of their battle. They had tried to burn her out, to break him. They had failed. He nodded slowly, a hard, cold resolve settling over him. "All right, Lena," he said. "We ride for Rivali." The journey to Rivali was cold and silent. They rode side by side, Jonah on his roan and Lena on the gray mare. Smoke. The blackened ruins of the cookhouse receded behind them, a scar on the landscape and in their minds. The county seat was a proper town, with a 2-story brick courthouse that seemed to loom over the muddy streets, a monument to a law that felt very far away from the daily realities of survival at Dry Willow. They met with a circuit judge, a man named Sterling, whose face was a roadmap of weary experience. He listened patiently in his chambers, his eyes missing nothing as Jonah laid out the story, his voice a low, controlled rumble of fury. He presented the forged documents, the notice of default, and told of the fire that had followed it. Banker Wilkes, summoned to the hearing, was the picture of civic concern, his smooth face arranged in an expression of regret. His lawyer, a sharp man in a city suit, was all bluster and objection. "Your Honor," the lawyer argued, "this is the desperate fantasy of a man facing financial ruin. Mr. Hale is looking for someone to blame for his own mismanagement. These documents are official. The bank's seal is impeccable." "The seal is a forgery," Lena said, her voice quiet but carrying in the still room. The lawyer turned on her, a condescending smirk on his face. "And what are your credentials? Miss, are you an expert in legal documents? A master of engraving?" "No, sir," Lena replied, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "I am a cook." A flicker of amusement crossed the lawyer's face. "A cook? I see. And I suppose you learned to spot forgeries between baking biscuits and boiling beans." "I learned to pay attention to details," Lena said, her gaze unwavering. "It is a cook's job to know what comes into her pantry and when. I keep a ledger." From a simple cloth bag, she produced her mother's recipe book. Tucked in the back were several pages filled with her neat, careful script. It was a record of supplies, dates, and inventories. She opened it to a specific page. "This is my kitchen ledger for the past month. Your Honor," she said, addressing Judge Sterling directly. "On Tuesday, the 10th of the month, a shipment of goods arrived from Helena. I signed for it myself. The shipment included coffee, flour, and a new box of sealing wax for the mercantile. It was a new type of wax, a deeper red, with a slightly different scent when burned. I know this because Mrs. Pike at the store complained that the new wax was inferior. I made a note of it here." She pointed a steady finger at an entry. "New red wax arrived today. Mrs. Pike displeased." She then picked up the fraudulent cancellation notice. "This document is dated Monday, the 9th. It is sealed with the new red wax that did not arrive in Gravel Bend until Tuesday the 10th. It is impossible for this document to have been sealed and sent on the day it claims." A profound silence filled the room. The lawyer's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief. Banker Wilkes's face paled slightly. Judge Sterling leaned forward, taking the ledger and the documents, his weary eyes suddenly sharp with interest. He examined the wax on the paper, then looked at Lena's neat, simple entry. It was the truth, undeniable and plain as a loaf of bread. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Lena continued, her confidence growing, "I believe Mr. Wilkes was working with Mr. Cole Baird, our foreman. Mr. Baird was in town the day before the fire. He was at the bank." An outrageous accusation, Wilkes blustered. "Is Mr. Baird here to testify?" Judge Sterling asked, looking at Wilkes. He had ranch business to attend to," Wilkes stammered. The judge's gaze was like a physical weight. "I see. I will take this evidence under review. My decision will be sent by courier to Dry Willow by tomorrow evening." As they left the courthouse, the weight of the world seemed to lift from Jonah's shoulders, replaced by a sense of awe. He looked at Lena, at the quiet strength that had faced down a city lawyer and a corrupt banker, armed with nothing more than a kitchen notebook and the simple truth. He had seen her courage before, but this was different. This was a mind as sharp and resilient as her spirit. The ride back was different, filled with a fragile, unspoken hope. But as they neared the ranch, their battle shifted from the quiet intensity of a courtroom to a primal struggle on the snowy hillsides. A frantic shout from Tim, who had been left in charge, drew their eyes to the upper pasture. A dark, fluid line of gray shapes was flowing down the hill toward the sheep pen. One Eye and his pack had returned, hungrier and more daring than ever. "Go to the house!" Lena Jonah yelled, already kicking his roan into a hard gallop. "Get the men!" But the men were already running from the bunkhouse, rifles in hand. Jonah did not wait. He rode hard, trying to get between the wolves and the terrified, bleating sheep. He knew rifles were of little use against the scattered, fast-moving pack in the fading light. They needed a different weapon. The tarps he roared at his men as they joined him. "Get the big canvas tarps from the shed and wet straw." It was a desperate gamble, an old trick for fighting prairie fires, not wolves. They worked with frantic speed, spreading the heavy canvas tarps on the snow upwind of the sheep pen. They piled damp, smoky straw underneath and lit it. A thick, acrid cloud of smoke began to billow out, clinging to the ground and rolling down the hill in a dense, choking fog, creating a wall between the attackers and their prey. The wolves, confused and blinded by the smoke, their keen sense of smell overwhelmed, slowed their attack. They whined and milled about, their assault broken. Jonah, on his horse, rode the edge of the smoke, yelling and firing his pistol into the air to keep the pack disorganized. And then he saw him, One Eye. The great gray wolf had not been fooled. He had circled around the smoke, a shadowy ray marvel, his single yellow eye burning with a cold, predatory intelligence. He was not after the flock. He was after the shepherd. The wolf launched himself not at the horse, but at Jonah's leg, his jaws aiming for the old wound he had taken years ago in a fall. The tearing pain was sickeningly familiar, a hot, sharp agony that shot up his thigh. Jonah cried out, kicking wildly, but the wolf's jaws held fast. His horse reared in terror, unseating him. Jonah crashed to the ground in the snow, his leg trapped, the wolf a snarling, gray fury on top of him. He fumbled for his knife, his other hand trying to shield his throat. He could smell the wolf's hot, rank breath. This was it, he thought, a stupid, savage end in the snow. Suddenly, another horse thundered toward them. It was Lena on the gray mare. Smoke, her face a pale, determined mask in the twilight. She was not carrying a rifle. In her hand was the small, heavy copper bell she kept on the back of her stove to call the men to supper. She rode straight at the wolf, and as she passed, she leaned down and threw the bell with all her might. The heavy copper struck the wolf squarely on the side of the head with a dull, metallic thud. The animal yelped, a high, thin sound of surprise and pain, and released its grip, staggering back. In that one moment of hesitation, Jonah scrambled free, grabbing the pistol he had dropped. He fired once. The wolf fell and lay still in the snow. The rest of the pack, seeing their leader fall, vanished back into the hills like ghosts. Lena was off the mare before it even stopped, rushing to his side, her bag with the bandages already in her hand from the fire. Jonah, he was alive. Adrenaline coursing through him, the pain in his leg a distant, throbbing drum. He looked at the dead wolf, then at Lena kneeling beside him in the snow, her hands already working to staunch the bleeding. She had saved him, not with a gun, but with a piece of her kitchen. Just as she was tying off the bandage, another sound reached them, the steady beat of a fast-riding horse. A courier from Rivali pulled his lathered horse to a stop, his eyes wide at the scene of smoke, men, and the dead wolf. He handed a sealed envelope to Jonah. With trembling, blood-stained fingers, Jonah broke the seal. He read the single page, his face unreadable in the gathering darkness. He looked up, first at his men, then at Lena. "Wilkes lost," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "The judge ruled the documents are fraudulent. He is recommending a full investigation by the territorial marshal into the bank's practices." He took a deep, shuddering breath. And they found Baird's tracks by the ashes of the cookhouse. His boot heel was packed with pine resin from the hay he used to start the fire. He has fled, but they have a warrant for his arrest. It was over. Both battles, the one of lies and paper and the one of teeth and claws, had been won in the same hour. The men let out a ragged cheer, a sound of profound relief. But Jonah only had eyes for Lena. She had been his witness, his defender, and his savior. He reached out, his hand finding hers, and held on as if he were a drowning man who had just found shore. The war for Dry Willow was over. Now they could begin to build. The ash from the fire was cold by the time the sun came up. Jonah sat on the porch steps of the main house, his bandaged leg propped up on a crate. The pain was a dull, steady companion, a physical reminder of the violence of the night before, but it was a clean pain, a pain of survival, not of defeat. He watched Lena move through the early morning light, her arm also bandaged. As she salvaged what little she could from the wreckage of the cookhouse, she moved with a purpose that belied the devastation, her back straight, her motions economical. She had found the copper kettle, blackened and dented but intact. The heavy iron pots were also salvageable. She arranged them near the back door of the main house, already planning a temporary kitchen. She was not a woman who waited for things to be fixed. She simply began fixing them herself. His men, waking from their exhausted sleep, came out and stood in a somber, silent group, looking at the ruin. The heart of the ranch was gone. Tim, the young hand whose frostbite Lena had treated, was the first to move. He picked up a charred beam and carried it to a growing pile for scrap, one by one. The others followed his lead, beginning the slow, grim work of clearing the debris. There were no orders given, none were needed. Jonah pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily on a carved stick one of the men had given him. He limped over to where Lena was scrubbing soot from a large skillet. "This will not do," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. She looked up, pausing in her work. "We will manage, sir. I can cook on the hearth in the main house for now." "I do not mean the cooking," he said. He looked at the empty space where the log building had stood. "We will not build it with logs again. Wood burns." He turned and looked toward the creek that bordered the lower pasture, its banks lined with smooth, gray river stones, worn by 1,000 years of water and ice. "We will build it with stone, a stone house, with a deep foundation." The idea took hold among the men. It was more than just rebuilding. It was an act of defiance. They would build something that no fire could take, something permanent and strong, like the woman it was being built for. The work began that day. The men who could be spared from the herd took wagons down to the creek and began hauling stones. Jonah, unable to do the heavy lifting, sat on a stool and directed the work, his eye for a straight line and a solid corner as sharp as ever. He was the architect of the new foundation. Lena was the architect of its heart. She drew the plans in the back of her recipe book, her pencil sketching out not just a kitchen, but a home. She designed a large, open room with a big hearth at one end and a cast-iron stove at the other. She added a pantry, bigger than the last one, and a small table for herself. And on the eastern wall, she drew a large window, so the morning sun can get in. She explained to Jonah when she showed him the drawing. He just nodded, a lump in his throat. He had lived his life looking west, at the setting sun, at endings. She was showing him how to look east, toward a new day. Word of the fire and the court's decisions spread through the territory like a grass fire. It was a story of David and Goliath, of a quiet cook and a determined rancher taking on a corrupt banker and winning. People who had once whispered about Lena now spoke her name with respect. Ranchers from neighboring spreads rode over, not with gossip, but with offers of help, with loads of lumber for the roof beams, with sacks of nails. One afternoon, a wagon from Gravel Bend pulled up. It was Mrs. Pike from the mercantile, her square face set in a look of grim determination. She climbed down and marched over to Lena, holding out a jar of strawberry jam. "I was wrong about you," she said, the words clipped as if they were hard to get out. "I listened to spiteful tongues. This town, we are quick to judge." She thrust the jam into Lena's hands. Tucked under the lid was a folded piece of paper. "My apologies," she said, then turned, climbed back into her wagon, and drove away without another word. Lena unfolded the paper. In Mrs. Pike's spidery handwriting were 2 words, "I am sorry." Lena looked at the jar of jam, a small, sweet offering of peace, and a slow smile spread across her face. The war with the town was over. As the stone walls rose, course by steady course, so did something new and solid between Lena and Jonah. He had given up his silence. He talked to her, not about the ranch or the weather, but about his father, about the dreams he had once had before his heart had been closed off. He learned to trust her counsel, not just about the contents of a pantry, but about the men, about the future of the ranch. He had torn down the vow he had made to himself, stone by bitter stone, and was learning to build a new one, based not on fear, but on a quiet, steady faith in the woman who had shown him what gentle love truly meant. He fell into a new routine. Every morning, he was the one who chopped the kindling for the temporary stove, stacking it neatly by the door. Every evening, after the last of the crew had eaten, he would stay behind, helping Lena clear away the dishes, wiping down the long trestle table they used for meals. They did not need to speak much during these times. Their shared work was a language all its own, a comfortable rhythm of domestic partnership that felt more real and binding than any formal words could be. Lena, in turn, blossomed in the newfound security and respect. The timid girl who had sought shelter from a storm was gone. In her place was a woman who was the undisputed heart of a thriving community. She started a small herb garden near the new foundation, her hands coaxing life from the cold soil. Young Tim, fascinated by her skills, asked if she would teach him how to bake bread. Soon, he was her willing apprentice, his large, clumsy hands learning the delicate art of folding dough under her patient guidance. She took to her recipe book again, but it was no longer just a ledger of supplies. In the evenings, by the light of a lantern, she would write. She wrote down her mother's recipes from memory, but she added her own notes, her own variations. She wrote down the words to the old songs she hummed, and sometimes she wrote new words, simple verses about the color of the sky over the bitterroots, about the sound of the wind, about the quiet strength of a man learning to love again. Her book was becoming a journal, a chronicle of a life being rebuilt from the ashes. Finally, the day came when the new cookhouse was finished. The stone walls were solid and true, the new roof tight against the sky. The large east-facing window flooded the room with clean, bright light. An old woodcarver from town, a man who had known Jonah's father, came out and presented them with a gift. It was a sign, carved from a single piece of seasoned pine, in elegant, simple letters. It read "The Quiet Stove," and underneath, in smaller letters, "Meals for the road-worn and the soft-spoken." They hung it over the door. That evening, they inaugurated the new kitchen. It was not a wild party, but a quiet gathering. Neighboring ranchers and their families came. Even Mrs. Pike was there, sharing a slice of Lena's apple pie. The big room was filled with the low hum of conversation, with the clink of forks on plates, with the smell of roasting beef and fresh bread. Lena moved through it all, a serene, confident presence, making sure everyone had enough to eat. Jonah, his leg now healing cleanly, stood by the hearth, watching her. He saw how people were drawn to her, how her quiet grace put everyone at ease. She was not just his cook. She was the center of this new world they were building. Later, after everyone had gone and the last dish was washed, they stood together in the middle of the new kitchen. A clean new white towel hung on its hook by the door. The copper kettle sat on the stove, humming its familiar, gentle song. Through the big window, they could see the stars beginning to appear in the vast, dark sky. He had lost a building, but he had gained a home. The old vow, born of bitterness and pride, was a ghost, a faint echo from another man's life. A new vow was forming in his heart, one he knew he would spend the rest of his life keeping. The winter, which had arrived with the fury of a wolf pack, retreated like a tired old dog. The snows melted under a strengthening sun, swelling the creeks and turning the prairie from a uniform white to 1,000 shades of brown and nascent green. The air, for the first time in months, carried the scent of damp earth and the promise of life. Spring came to Dry Willow not as a single event, but as a slow, quiet unfolding, a gradual unclenching of the land's fist. The new stone cookhouse, the quiet stove, stood as if it had always been there, its gray walls solid against the remnants of the last snowdrifts. Its east-facing window caught the first rays of dawn, and by the time the sun was fully up, the smell of coffee and baking bread would already be drifting from its chimney, a warm, welcoming signal in the vast, open country. One afternoon in early April, a deputy marshal from Ravalli rode in, his horse splattered with the mud of a long journey. He found Jonah reinforcing a corral fence, the movements of his healed leg only slightly stiff. Lena came out from the cookhouse, wiping her hands on her apron, and stood beside him. "Jonah Hale," the deputy asked, touching the brim of his hat. "I am," Jonah said. "Just thought you would want to know. We got him, Cole Baird." The deputy shifted in his saddle. He made it as far as the Idaho Panhandle, got caught trying to sell a string of horses that did not belong to him. He was a fool, and he got sloppy. He is on his way back to the territorial prison to stand trial for the horses, and for arson. He will not be bothering you again. The news settled over them, not with a crash, but with a quiet finality. It was the closing of a door on a dark and painful chapter. Jonah looked at Lena, and she at him. There was no triumph in their eyes, only a shared, weary relief. The last ghost of their hard winter had been laid to rest. "Thank you for riding all this way to tell us," Jonah said simply. The deputy nodded, accepted a mug of hot coffee from Lena, and was on his way. A small, transient figure of the law in a land that was still making its own. Life settled into the rhythms of the new season. The quiet stove became more than just the ranch's kitchen. Sometimes a circuit preacher would stop for a hot meal on his way to another small congregation, or a family in a weathered wagon, heading west to seek their fortune, would be drawn by the curl of smoke and the simple, welcoming sign. Lena would feed them all, never asking for payment, though they often left a small coin or a handful of dried apples on the table in gratitude. The kitchen was becoming what its sign promised, a refuge for the road-worn. Jonah watched it all, his heart filled with a quiet wonder. He had built a ranch, a place of cattle and fences and hard work. Lena had built a home, a place of warmth and welcome and gentle conversation. Together, they had built a future. One evening, a soft spring rain began to fall, a steady, whispering sound on the new shingled roof. It was a gentle rain, the kind that coaxes the grass to grow and settles the dust. Inside the quiet stove, a fire crackled on the hearth, its light dancing on the stone walls. The day's work was done. The men were in the bunkhouse, the sounds of a harmonica drifting faintly on the damp air. Jonah and Lena sat at the small table by the window, the same table where she had tended to his cracked and bleeding hands what felt like a lifetime ago. A single lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light over them. Outside, the world was turning a deep, misty blue. Lena was mending a tear in one of Jonah's shirts, her needle moving with a practiced, rhythmic grace. Jonah was oiling a piece of harness leather, his hands strong and sure. The silence between them was comfortable, a shared space built of trust and understanding. "The Miller family stopped today," Lena said softly, not looking up from her sewing. "The ones heading for the Oregon country. The little girl, Sarah. She had eyes the color of a summer sky." Jonah stopped his work, a small smile touching his lips. "She made you think of someone. She made me think that this room, as big as it is, will feel empty until we hear the sound of small feet running across this floor," Lena said, her voice barely a whisper. He reached across the table and placed his hand over hers, stilling her needle. Her fingers were warm. He looked at her, at the way the lamplight caught the soft curve of her cheek, at the steady, honest gaze that had seen him through the darkest of times. The fierce, protective love he felt for her was a physical thing, a warmth that spread from his chest through his entire body. "I would like that," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "A son to learn the ways of the land, a daughter to learn to sing from her mother." He paused, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, "and a kitchen big enough for them to bring all the travelers they want to home for supper." She looked up at him then, her eyes shining. The future they spoke of felt as real and solid as the stone walls around them. It was a future built not on a grand dream, but on the simple, powerful foundation of their shared lives. He held her hand, his gaze filled with the weight of all the things he had never known how to say. "I lived a long time behind a wall I built myself," he said, his voice low and earnest. "It was a bitter, lonely place. You walked right through it. Lena, you did not even seem to notice it was there." He took a slow, deep breath, letting go of the last remnants of the man he used to be, a long time ago. "I swore an oath to keep every pretty woman away from me for the rest of my days. Tonight, in this house you built, I swear to keep one good and gentle woman close to me for the rest of my life." The promise hung in the air, simple, profound, and unbreakable. It was a vow made not in a church, but in the heart of the home they had forged together from fire and faith. Outside, the gentle rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. From the shelter of the nearby barn, the gray mare, Smoke, gave a low, soft nicker, a sound of contentment. On the back of the stove, the little copper bell, the one that had saved his life, gave a single, soft chime as the fire settled. On its hook by the door, a new, clean white towel hung, bright and unblemished, a silent testament to a new beginning, to a life washed clean and ready to be lived. Jonah held Lena's hand, and in the quiet warmth of their kitchen, they listened to the sound of the rain and the promise of all the springs yet to come. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to my channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.